The notification sound from my phone cut through the silence of my empty apartment like a knife. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I'd just finished updating my resume for the third time that day. My hands were still shaking from the meeting with Amanda Foster, my now former boss, who delivered the news with all the warmth of a corporate email. Budget cuts, they said. Restructuring, they claimed. But I knew the truth. I'd been the highest paid person in my department, and they needed to make their numbers look better for the board. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at my phone screen, thumb hovering over the Thompson Family group chat. These were supposed to be the people who had my back, who'd celebrate my wins and catch me when I fell. For the past 3 years, I'd been their safety net, their go-to guy when rent was short, when the car broke down, when medical bills piled up. I'd skipped vacations, worked overtime, lived in this cramped one-bedroom apartment while they enjoyed their 4-bedroom house in Cedar Park, all because I believed family meant something. The message I typed was simple, honest, vulnerable. Lost my job today, feeling pretty devastated, could really use some support right now. I hit send and waited, expecting the flood of concerned messages, the phone calls, maybe even someone offering to bring dinner or just sit with me while I processed this nightmare. Instead, what came back destroyed everything I thought I knew about the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My name is Marcus Thompson, and what happened next changed my relationship with my family forever. The first response came from my mom, Patricia, at exactly 2:51 p.m., 4 minutes. 4 minutes was all it took for her to type the words that would shatter 28 years of believing I mattered to these people. Good. Now you can finally move out of that apartment and find somewhere cheaper. We've been enabling you long enough. I read it twice, certain I was misunderstanding. Enabling me. I was the one who'd been covering their mortgage shortfall every month for the past year. I was the one who'd paid for Jessica's car repairs just last week, who'd covered Kevin's community college tuition, who'd sent money when Dad needed new work boots. But somehow, in their minds, I was the one being enabled. The second message came from my sister Jessica, and it hit even harder than Mom's. Honestly, Marcus, maybe this is a wake-up call. You've been living above your means for years. Time to grow up and face reality. Living above my means. I'd been eating ramen noodles and skipping meals so I could afford to keep their lights on. I'd been wearing the same 5 shirts to work for 2 years while making sure they could afford their Netflix subscription and weekend dinners out. My brother Kevin chimed in next, and his message felt like a punch to the stomach. Yeah, man, probably time to move back home with Mom and Dad so you can get your life together. But you'll need to contribute to household expenses since you'll be eating our food and using our utilities. Our food. As if I hadn't been the one paying for half of it already. As if I hadn't been subsidizing their lifestyle while sacrificing my own. The silence from my father, Robert, was somehow worse than all their words combined. He was the one I'd looked up to my entire life, the one who'd taught me about responsibility and taking care of family. He'd watched me pour thousands of dollars into keeping their household afloat, had personally asked me for help with the mortgage just 3 months ago, when he was between construction jobs, and now, when I needed him most, he was nowhere to be found. I sat on my couch, still in my work clothes, staring at these messages that felt like they'd been written by strangers. The apartment around me suddenly felt smaller, stuffier, like the walls were closing in. This was supposed to be my safe space, the place I came home to after long days of covering for my family's financial shortcomings. Now it felt like a trap, a reminder of how alone I really was. The messages kept coming. Mom again, this time with more specific instructions. You should look for a room to rent somewhere cheap, maybe with roommates. That apartment was always too expensive for someone in your position anyway. My position. I'd been making $75,000 a year, had excellent credit, had been a reliable tenant for 4 years, but apparently, that was too ambitious for someone like me in her eyes. Jessica piled on with her own brand of helpful advice. There are tons of people looking for roommates on Craigslist. You could probably find something for like $400 a month if you're not picky. And maybe this is a sign you should consider a career change anyway. Tech jobs are so unstable. Career change. As if losing one job meant I should abandon the field I'd trained for, the skills I'd developed, the experience I'd gained. As if I should just give up and settle for whatever scraps life threw my way. Kevin's contribution was perhaps the most insulting of all. Mom and Dad have been talking about converting the garage into a room anyway. If you pay for the renovation costs, you could probably move in there until you get back on your feet. It would be win-win. Pay for the renovation. Even when offering me a place to stay, they wanted me to fund it. Even in my moment of crisis, they were looking for ways to extract more money from me. I looked around my apartment with fresh eyes, seeing it the way they apparently saw it. The modest furniture I'd saved up for piece by piece, the small kitchen where I'd learned to cook meals for one, because I couldn't afford to eat out after sending money home every month, the single bedroom with the queen bed I'd bought used, the desk where I'd worked countless hours of freelance projects to make sure I could cover their emergencies and my own basic needs. This wasn't living above my means, this was barely living at all. The reality of my situation began to crystallize with sharp, painful clarity. For 3 years, I'd been operating under the delusion that my financial support to my family was appreciated, that it was building bonds and creating a foundation of mutual love and respect. I'd told myself that the sacrifices were worth it, that someday when I needed help, they'd be there for me the same way I'd been there for them. Instead, they saw me as an ATM with legs, useful only as long as the money kept flowing. The moment I showed vulnerability, the moment I needed support instead of providing it, I became a burden to be managed rather than a family member to be cherished. I opened my banking app and scrolled through 3 years of transaction history. The pattern was undeniable and heartbreaking. Monthly transfers to mom and dad for mortgage help, emergency payments for car repairs, medical bills, utility shutoffs, gifts for birthdays and holidays that were never reciprocated, loans that were never repaid, despite promises that they.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They would be. The numbers were staggering when I added them up, over $40,000 in the past 3 years alone, money that could have built me a solid emergency fund, could have paid for additional training and certifications, could have gone toward a down payment on a house of my own. Instead, it had disappeared into their lives, enabling them to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford while painting me as the irresponsible one. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Dad, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe he'd been in a meeting, maybe he'd been thinking about what to say, maybe he'd be the voice of reason and compassion I desperately needed to hear. I opened his message with trembling fingers. Son, your mother is right, this might be the kick in the pants you needed. You've been coasting for too long, thinking that tech job made you special. Time to learn what real work looks like. Come home, help around the house, contribute to the family, and maybe you'll figure out what actually matters in life. Coasting, thinking I was special, as if working 50-hour weeks to support both my own life and subsidize theirs, was somehow lazy or entitled, as if the skills I'd developed, and the career I'd built, were somehow less valuable than whatever they imagined real work to be. The condescension dripped from every word, the complete dismissal of everything I'd accomplished and sacrificed. I realized in that moment that they'd never respected me at all. They'd seen my success not as something to be proud of, but as a resource to be exploited. They'd never viewed our relationship as a partnership of mutual support, but as a hierarchy where I was expected to give everything and ask for nothing in return. The apartment felt different now, charged with a new energy I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger yet, not quite. It was something colder and more focused. A kind of crystalline clarity that cut through years of conditioning and people-pleasing and desperate attempts to earn love that was never really on the table. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the Austin skyline, at the city where I'd built a life and a career, where I'd found independence and purpose. These people wanted me to give all of that up, to move back into their garage like a failure, to fund my own humiliation while they continued to take everything I had to offer. The realization hit me like a physical force. I didn't have to do any of that. I had savings, not much after years of supporting them, but enough to survive for a few months while I job hunted. I had skills that were in demand, a resume that told the story of competence and growth, references who would speak to my character and abilities. I had built something here, something that was mine, something that didn't require their approval or support. Most importantly, I had a choice. I could continue playing the role they'd assigned me, miss the family ATM who funded their lifestyle while accepting scraps of affection in return, or I could choose something different. Something harder, maybe, but infinitely more honest. My phone lit up again with another round of messages, each one more presumptuous than the last. Mom had started making lists of things I'd need to do before moving out of my apartment. Jessica was sending me links to roommate wanted ads she'd found online. Kevin was calculating how much I'd need to contribute to household expenses if I moved into their garage. Not one of them had asked how I was feeling. Not one had acknowledged that losing a job was traumatic, that I might be scared or sad or overwhelmed. Not one had offered emotional support, a listening ear, or even basic human compassion. They'd simply seen an opportunity to reorganize their lives to their advantage and had started making plans. I sat back down on my couch and let the weight of this realization settle into my bones. These people didn't love me, they loved what I could do for them, what I could provide, how I could solve their problems and fund their dreams. But Marcus the person, Marcus with his own hopes and fears and needs, was invisible to them. The grief of this understanding was overwhelming, but underneath it was something else. Something that felt like the first breath of air, after being underwater for years. I didn't have to keep drowning to keep them afloat. I didn't have to sacrifice my own future to subsidize their present. I didn't have to earn love that was never really available for purchase. I could choose differently, I could choose myself. The decision crystallized slowly, like ice forming on a window, clear and solid and irreversible. I opened my banking app and began scrolling through my automatic payments, looking for every single transfer I'd set up to support their various needs and wants. The mortgage contribution, the car insurance payment for Jessica's vehicle, the subscription services I'd been covering, the emergency fund I'd maintained for their crises. One by one, I began canceling them all. My finger hovered over the cancel button for the automatic mortgage transfer. $850 every month for the past 14 months, money that had kept their house out of foreclosure when Dad's construction work slowed down last winter. They'd promised it was temporary, just until things picked up again. That was over a year ago, and Dad had been working steady for months now, but somehow my contribution had become a permanent fixture in their budget. I pressed cancel and watched the confirmation screen appear, transaction canceled. No more automatic transfers. A strange sensation washed over me, something between nausea and relief. The next payment had been scheduled for tomorrow, the 15th of the month. They wouldn't realize it was missing until they tried to make their mortgage payment and came up short. The car insurance for Jessica's Honda was next. $43 a month that I'd been covering since she graduated from college last year. She'd asked for help, just until she found a job, she'd said. That job had materialized 6 months ago, working as a receptionist at a dental office, but somehow she'd never mentioned taking over her own insurance payments. When I'd brought it up once, she'd laughed it off, saying the money was better in her pocket than the insurance companies, and family should help family. Cancel. Confirmation, done. Kevin's community college payments were more substantial, $1,200 per semester, plus books and supplies. He was studying business management, though he'd changed his major 3 times in 2 years and seemed more interested in the social aspects of college than the academic ones. He'd failed 2 classes last semester and had to retake them, doubling the cost, but when I'd suggested he might want to take school more seriously, given the financial investment, Mom had accused me of being unsupportive of his education. Cancel. Another confirmation screen. Another small act of revolution. The streaming services were almost insulting in their pettiness. Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, HBO Max, $160 a month for entertainment subscriptions that I'd added to my accounts so the family could have access. They all had their own devices, their own viewing preferences, their own complaints when something wasn't available on one platform or another. I'd become their personal entertainment coordinator, managing passwords and profiles and payment methods so they could binge watch shows while I worked overtime to afford their leisure. Every subscription, canceled, every automatic payment, stopped, every financial lifeline I'd extended, severed. The emergency fund was the hardest one to touch. $5,000 sitting in a separate savings account, money I'd set aside specifically for family crises. I'd dipped into it for Dad's unexpected medical bills, for the time Jessica's car needed a new transmission, for the roof repairs after the hailstorm last spring. It was money that represented my love and commitment, my desire to be the kind of person my family could count on when everything went wrong, but as I stared at the account balance, I realized it had become something else entirely. It had become an enabler, a way for them to avoid dealing with the consequences of their own financial choices. They knew I had this money set aside, knew I'd bail them out when things got tough, so they never bothered to build their own emergency funds or make more responsible decisions. I transferred the entire balance into my main checking account. If I was going to be unemployed for a while, I'd need every dollar to survive. They'd managed to live for years before I'd established this safety net for them. They could figure out how to do it again. My phone started ringing before I'd even finished the last transfer. Mom's contact photo filled the screen, the picture I'd taken of her at last year's family barbecue, where she was laughing at something Dad had said. She looked happy and carefree in that photo, the way she always looked when money wasn't an immediate concern. The way she could afford to look because she knew I was handling the financial worries behind the scenes. I declined the call and watched as a voicemail notification appeared almost immediately, then another call, this time from Jessica, decline. Another voicemail. Kevin called next, which surprised me because he rarely called anyone about anything, preferring to communicate through video games and text messages. The fact that he was actually making a phone call suggested that word was spreading quickly through the family network. I set the phone to silent and placed it face down on my coffee table. Whatever they had to say could wait. I needed this time to think, to process what I'd just done, to prepare myself for the storm that was certainly coming. The apartment felt different now, lighter somehow, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't fully realized was there. The financial obligations I'd accepted so gradually, one request at a time, had accumulated into a massive burden that had shaped every decision I made, whether to take a vacation, whether to buy new clothes, whether to go out with friends, or save for something I wanted more. Every choice had been filtered through the question of whether I could afford it while still meeting my family's needs. Now suddenly, those constraints were gone. The money I earned would be mine to spend or save as I chose. The emergency fund would exist for my emergencies, not theirs. My financial decisions would be based on my goals and priorities, not their expectations and demands. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I walked to my kitchen and opened the refrigerator, looking at the sparse contents with new eyes. Leftover takeout from 2 days ago, some wilted vegetables, a carton of milk that would expire tomorrow. This was how I'd been living, scraping by on the basics, while my family enjoyed financial security funded by my sacrifices. No more elaborate grocery shopping, because every extra dollar went to them. No more nice meals or quality ingredients, because I had to prioritize their comfort over my own. The reality of their manipulation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. They'd positioned my support as temporary help during tough times, but they'd systematically incorporated it into their permanent lifestyle. They'd made me feel guilty for having career success while painting themselves as struggling, when in reality, they were struggling because they'd become dependent on my subsidies, rather than adjusting their spending to match their actual income. My phone lit up with text notifications, but I ignored them. The voicemails were piling up too, little red badges of their increasing panic as they realized something was wrong. They'd probably checked their accounts by now, seen the missing payments, started to understand that their financial foundation had shifted beneath their feet. good, let them panic, let them scramble to figure out how to cover the obligations they'd shifted to me. Let them experience the stress and uncertainty I'd been carrying for years while they slept soundly knowing I'd handle everything. I thought about Tyler, my friend and former coworker, who'd tried to warn me about this dynamic months ago. We'd been grabbing lunch, and I'd casually mentioned sending money home again for another family emergency. Tyler had looked at me with concern and asked how many emergencies one family could realistically have. He'd pointed out that my family seemed to have a crisis every few months, always right around the time I got a bonus or a raise, always conveniently solved by my financial intervention. At the time, I'd been defensive. I'd explained that family was important, that helping each other was what you did when you loved someone, that I was fortunate to be in a position to help, and shouldn't be selfish with my success. Tyler had backed off, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the concern that I was being taken advantage of by people who should be protecting me instead of exploiting me. He'd been right, of course, I just hadn't been ready to see it. The pattern was so clear now that I wonder how I'd missed it for so long. Every time I achieved something professionally, a promotion, a raise, a bonus, my family's financial problems would mysteriously intensify. Dad's work would slow down just as I got a salary increase. Jessica's car would break down right after I mentioned my performance bonus. Kevin would need money for school expenses whenever I had extra income to spare. They'd been monitoring my success like a resource to be harvested, timing their crises to coincide with my ability to pay for them. It wasn't coincidence or bad luck, it was calculated manipulation designed to keep me financially drained and emotionally committed to their well-being. The worst part was how they'd made me complicit in my own exploitation. They'd praised me for being generous and responsible, had made me feel like the family hero for always coming through in clutch moments. They'd fed my need to be needed, my desire to be valued and appreciated, while simultaneously ensuring that I never had enough resources to become truly independent or secure. It was a perfect trap, and I'd walked into it willingly, because I'd wanted so desperately to believe that love and money could be connected, that my financial contributions were building something meaningful and lasting with the people who mattered most to me. My phone buzzed insistently against the coffee table, and I could see text notifications stacking up on the screen. The family group chat was exploding with activity, but I didn't need to read the messages to know what they contained. Panic, accusations, demands for explanations, attempts to guilt me back into compliance. They'd probably started with confusion, wondering if there was some technical glitch with the bank transfers. Then concern, as they realized the cancellations were intentional. Now they'd be moving into crisis mode, frantically calculating how to cover the shortfalls, pointing fingers at each other for depending too heavily on my contributions, and ultimately settling on anger directed at me for abandoning them in their time of need. The irony was breathtaking. I was the one who'd lost my job, who was facing uncertainty and financial stress, who'd reached out for emotional support during a difficult time. But somehow, I'd become the villain in their story, simply for withdrawing the financial support that had never been sustainable or fair in the first place. I picked up my laptop and opened my email, scrolling through job listings and networking opportunities with renewed focus. Without the monthly drain of supporting my family, my savings would last significantly longer. I could afford to be more selective about my next position, could hold out for something that offered real growth potential instead of jumping at the first offer out of desperation. For the first time in years, I could make career decisions based on what was best for my future rather than what would generate the quickest income to support their lifestyle. I could invest in additional training or certifications, could take the time to build a stronger professional network, could even consider relocating if the right opportunity presented itself. The freedom was dizzying. I'd been operating under so many constraints for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have genuine choices about my own life. My phone started ringing again, this time with Dad's number, the man who'd taught me about responsibility and family loyalty, who'd told me that success meant nothing if you didn't use it to help the people you loved. I wondered what he'd say now, how he'd frame my decision to prioritize my own financial security over their convenience. I let it go to voicemail like all the others. Whatever he had to say, whatever guilt or manipulation or appeals to family loyalty he wanted to deploy, I wasn't ready to hear it. I needed this space to think clearly, to make decisions from a place of strength, rather than emotional reactivity. The sun was setting outside my windows, casting long shadows across my living room. It had been less than 6 hours since I'd lost my job, less than 4 hours since my family had responded to my vulnerability with callous demands for further sacrifice. In that short time, I'd dismantled years of financial entanglement and created the foundation for a completely different kind of life, a life where my success belonged to me, where my money funded my dreams instead of subsidizing their irresponsibility, where family meant mutual support and genuine love, rather than exploitation disguised as obligation. It was going to be difficult. They weren't going to accept this change quietly, and I'd probably face months of pressure to resume my role as their financial safety net. There would be guilt trips and emotional manipulation, accusations that I was selfish and ungrateful, threats to cut me off from family gatherings and celebrations, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was making choices from a position of strength, rather than desperation. I was choosing myself, choosing my future, choosing a life built on authentic relationships, rather than financial transactions. The phone continued to buzz with notifications, the family crisis intensifying with each passing hour, but I was no longer part of that crisis. I was no longer responsible for solving their problems or funding their lifestyle choices. I was free to focus on my own challenges, my own goals, my own version of success, and that freedom felt like the first honest breath I'd taken in years. The morning came with a vengeance. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, my mind racing through every conversation, every financial transaction, every moment over the past 3 years when I should have seen what was happening. The phone had finally stopped buzzing around 2 in the morning, but the silence felt more ominous than the constant notifications. It meant they were regrouping, strategizing, preparing for a coordinated assault on my newfound boundaries. I made coffee with hands that were steadier than I expected, and sat at my small kitchen table, looking out at the Austin morning. Joggers were already hitting the trails, dog walkers were making their rounds, and the world was continuing its normal rhythm while mine had fundamentally shifted. There was something surreal about how ordinary everything looked when I felt like I'd undergone a complete transformation overnight. My phone showed 47 missed calls and 63 unread text messages. The family group chat had exploded to over 200 messages, a digital manifestation of their collective panic. I scrolled through the preview snippets without opening them fully, getting a sense of how the night had progressed from confusion to anger to desperation. Mom had started with practical concerns about the mortgage payment, then escalated to accusations that I was having some kind of breakdown. Jessica had cycled through anger, bargaining, and what appeared to be a complete meltdown about her car insurance being cancelled. Kevin had mostly sent crying emojis and demands that I explain myself. Dad's messages were shorter but carried the weight of disappointment and authority he'd always wielded so effectively. The voicemails painted an even clearer picture of their deteriorating composure. I played the first few, hearing Mom's voice progress from concerned to frantic to coldly furious. By the fourth voicemail, she was no longer asking for explanations, she was making demands, issuing ultimatums, threatening consequences that revealed just how transactional our relationship had always been. This is your mother, and I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but it stops now. Your father and I raised you better than this. We taught you about responsibility and loyalty, and this is how you repay us. By abandoning your family when we need you most. You have until 5 o'clock today to call me back and fix this mess you've created, or there will be serious consequences. Serious consequences. As if I were still a child who could be grounded or have privileges revoked. As if the only leverage they'd ever had over me wasn't my own misguided desire to earn their love through financial sacrifice. The tone was so patronizing, so completely lacking in self-awareness about what they'd been asking of me, that I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Jessica's voicemails were more manipulative, alternating between tears and rage in a performance that might have worked on me even a week ago. She talked about trust and betrayal, about how she'd counted on me, and now didn't know how she'd afford her car payment. She painted herself as the victim of my sudden selfishness, conveniently forgetting that she'd been perfectly capable of paying her own bills before I'd started covering them. Marcus, I can't believe you're doing this to me. I trusted you. I thought you cared about your family, but I guess I was wrong. I guess money is more important to you than the people who love you. I don't even know who you are anymore. Mom is crying, Dad is furious, and Kevin is talking about dropping out of school because he can't afford it without your help. Is that what you wanted? To destroy our family? Because congratulations, you're succeeding. The emotional manipulation was so transparent, so obviously calculated to trigger my guilt and protective instincts, that I felt almost insulted by how little credit they gave me for intelligence. Did they really think I'd fall for the same tactics they'd been using for years? Did they honestly believe I couldn't see through the manufactured crisis and artificial urgency? Kevin's approach was different, more direct in its selfishness. His voicemails skipped the emotional manipulation and went straight to practical concerns about his tuition and living expenses. He talked about his plans for the semester, the classes he'd registered for, the textbooks he needed to buy, all as if my financial support was a given rather than a gift that could be withdrawn. Dude, I don't know what's going on with you, but you're seriously messing up my whole semester. I've already registered for classes, and if you don't pay the tuition by Friday, I'm going to get dropped from everything. Is that what you want? To ruin my education because you're having some kind of crisis? That's not fair to me, Marcus. I didn't do anything wrong. The entitlement was breathtaking. Not once did he acknowledge that my financial support had always been voluntary, that it wasn't something he'd earned or deserved, that it represented significant sacrifice on my part. In his mind, my money had become his money, and my withdrawal of support was theft rather than the restoration of natural boundaries. Dad's voicemails were the most devastating, because they carried the weight of a lifetime of conditioning about what it meant to be a man, a son, a responsible member of the family. His voice was controlled but cold, disappointed in the way that had always cut me to the core when I was growing up. Son, I'm not sure what's gotten into you, but this behavior is unacceptable. Your mother is beside herself, your sister is in tears, and your brother's education is in jeopardy because of your selfish decision. I raised you to be better than this. I taught you that family comes first, that success means nothing if you don't use it to take care of the people who matter. You've forgotten those lessons, and frankly, I'm ashamed of the man you've become. Ashamed. The word hit like a physical blow, triggering years of conditioning about earning his approval and living up to his expectations. But underneath the familiar sting was something new, a recognition of how unfair and manipulative his disappointment had always been. He was ashamed of me for setting boundaries, for refusing to continue subsidizing their lifestyle, for prioritizing my own financial security after losing my job. But he'd never been ashamed of taking my money, of allowing me to sacrifice my own stability for their comfort, of treating me like a resource rather than a son. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd missed it for so long. Every conversation we'd had about money had been framed in terms of my obligations to them, never their responsibilities to themselves or to me. Every financial crisis had been presented as a test of my character, my loyalty, my worthiness as a family member. They'd weaponized love itself, making it conditional on my willingness to impoverish myself for their benefit. I deleted all the voicemails without listening to the rest, whatever escalations they contained, whatever new strategies they deployed to break down my resistance. I didn't need to hear them. I'd gotten enough of a sample to understand their approach, and nothing they could say would change the fundamental reality of what had happened. They'd shown me who they really were when I was vulnerable and needed support, They'd revealed that their love was transactional, their concern conditional, their family bonds purely financial. No amount of guilt or manipulation could undo that revelation or convince me to pretend I hadn't seen it. I opened my laptop and began responding to job postings with a focus and energy I hadn't felt in years. Without the constant drain of supporting my family, I could afford to be strategic about my job search. I could target positions that offered real growth opportunities rather than just quick paychecks. I could invest time in networking and skill development rather than rushing into the first available role. My savings account showed a balance that surprised me. Without the monthly transfers to my family, without the emergency fund held hostage by their recurring crises, I had enough money to survive for several months even without unemployment benefits. For the first time in my adult life, I had genuine financial security that belonged entirely to me. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I'd become so accustomed to living paycheck to paycheck despite my decent salary, so used to calculating every purchase against my family's needs, that having discretionary income felt almost foreign. I could buy quality food, could replace my worn-out work clothes, could even consider taking a weekend trip or pursuing a hobby without feeling guilty about the expense. My phone buzzed with a new text message, but this time it wasn't from a family member. Tyler's name appeared on the screen with a simple message: "Heard about the layoffs at your company. You okay? Want to grab coffee and talk about next steps?" The contrast was stark and immediate. Here was someone offering actual support, genuine concern for my well-being, practical help with my real problems. No demands for money, no guilt trips about obligations, no manipulation disguised as love, just straightforward human compassion from someone who had no financial stake in my success. I texted back immediately. "Coffee sounds perfect. How about that place on South Lamar in an hour?" Within minutes he'd confirmed the time and location. No drama, no emotional manipulation, no conditions attached to his friendship. Just the simple acknowledgement that I was going through a difficult time and could use some support from someone who cared about me as a person, rather than as a source of income. The comparison to my family's response was devastating in its clarity. Tyler, who owed me nothing and had no claim on my resources, had offered exactly what I needed: understanding, practical help, and genuine human connection. My family, who claimed to love me unconditionally, had seen my crisis as an opportunity to reorganize their finances at my expense. I dressed carefully for the coffee meeting, choosing clothes that made me feel confident and professional despite the uncertainty of my situation. For years, I dressed for work while mentally calculating whether I could afford to replace worn-out items, or if that money needed to go toward my family's needs instead. Now I could focus on presenting myself well, because it served my own interests rather than preserving resources for other people's priorities. The drive to the coffee shop felt different too. I wasn't rushing to squeeze in a quick meeting between work obligations and family emergencies. I wasn't checking my phone constantly for the next crisis that would require my immediate financial attention. I was simply driving to meet a friend, with no agenda beyond getting support and advice during a challenging time. Tyler was already waiting when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He stood up to greet me with a genuine smile and a handshake that turned into a brief hug. The warmth and normalcy of the interaction almost brought tears to my eyes after the emotional violence of my family's response. "So," he said as we sat down, "tell me what happened, and don't give me the corporate PR version. I want to know how you're really doing." The invitation to be honest, to share my actual feelings rather than maintaining a facade of strength, was so foreign that I almost didn't know how to respond. When had someone last asked how I was really doing without immediately following up with a request for money or a crisis that needed my attention? I told him everything. The layoff, the family group chat, their complete lack of support or compassion, the financial obligations I'd been carrying for years, and finally, my decision to cancel all the automatic payments and reclaim my financial independence. Tyler listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned as the story unfolded. "Marcus," he said when I finished, "that's not a family, that's a financial pyramid scheme with DNA." The bluntness of his assessment was shocking and liberating at the same time. I'd been so deep in the dysfunction for so long that I'd lost perspective on how abnormal the dynamic had become. Hearing it described so starkly by someone outside the situation helped me see just how far from healthy family relationships I'd traveled. "You know what's crazy?" I said, feeling the words form as I spoke them. "I keep waiting to feel guilty about cutting them off. I keep expecting the regret to hit, the doubt about whether I did the right thing, but mostly I just feel relieved, like I can finally breathe again." Tyler nodded knowingly. "That's because you've been drowning for years, and you finally made it to the surface. Of course you feel relieved. The question is, what are you going to do now that you can breathe again?" It was a good question, one that opened up possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider in years. What did I want from my career? What kind of life did I want to build? What would make me happy beyond just surviving financially and meeting other people's expectations? For the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom to find out. The following weeks unfolded like watching someone else's life in fast forward. My phone had finally stopped ringing constantly, though the occasional text still came through with increasingly desperate pleas and threats. The family had moved through the classic stages of manipulation: grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and what appeared to be a grudging acceptance that their financial ATM had permanently closed for business. Tyler and I had spent that afternoon planning my job search strategy, but more importantly, he'd helped me understand something crucial about healthy relationships. Real support didn't come with strings attached. Real love didn't require financial proof. Real family didn't abandon you the moment you stopped being useful to them. The contrast became even more stark when I started telling other friends about what had happened. My college roommate David called me within hours of hearing about the job loss, offering everything from a place to crash to connections in his company's IT department. My neighbor Mrs. Chen, who barely knew me beyond polite hallway conversations, brought over homemade soup when she heard I was job hunting. Even my barista at the local coffee shop, someone whose name I'd only learned recently, asked how the search was going and refused to let me pay for my drink one morning. These people owed me nothing. I'd never given them money, never bailed them out of emergencies, never positioned myself as their financial savior. Yet they offered genuine kindness and support during my difficult time. The difference was so obvious it was almost laughable. I'd been pouring thousands of dollars into relationships that yielded nothing but exploitation, while genuine care and concern were available for free from people who simply saw me as a human being worthy of compassion. 3 weeks after that devastating group chat, I got a call from a tech company in downtown Austin. They'd seen my resume on a job board and wanted to schedule an interview for a senior systems analyst position. The salary range they mentioned was 15% higher than what I'd been making, with better benefits and opportunities for advancement. More importantly, the company culture emphasized work-life balance and professional development, things I'd never prioritized when every spare dollar was flowing toward family emergencies. I scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday and spent the weekend preparing with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt about work in years. Without the constant background stress of managing my family's financial crises, I could focus entirely on presenting my skills and experience. I researched the company thoroughly, prepared thoughtful questions about their technology stack and growth plans, and even bought a new shirt for the occasion without calculating whether that money should go elsewhere. The interview went better than I'd dared to hope. The hiring manager, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, was impressed with my technical knowledge and experience. But what seemed to clinch the opportunity was my answer to her question about what I was looking for in my next role. I want to work somewhere that values growth and innovation, I told her. I've spent the last few years in a very stable but limiting environment, and I'm ready to challenge myself with new technologies and bigger responsibilities. I'm looking for a place where my contributions can make a real difference, where I can build something meaningful. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth, either. What I was really looking for was a place where my success would belong to me, where my achievements wouldn't be immediately siphoned off to fund other people's lifestyle choices. I wanted to work somewhere that would help me build the independent, financially secure life I'd never been allowed to pursue. Sarah offered me the position the next day. The salary increase would allow me to not only rebuild my emergency fund, but also start investing in my own future for the first time in my adult life. I could take professional development courses, could save for a down payment on a house, could even consider graduate school if I wanted to advance my career further. The possibilities felt endless after years of living within the narrow constraints of my family's financial expectations. I accepted the offer immediately and gave notice at my current company, though technically I'd already been laid off. The paperwork and transition would take 2 weeks, giving me time to mentally prepare for this new chapter. More importantly, it gave me time to solidify the boundaries I'd established with my family before starting fresh with new energy and focus. The family hadn't given up entirely, though their tactics had evolved. Mom had enlisted my Aunt Linda to call me, hoping that someone outside the immediate family might have better luck breaking through my defenses. Linda tried the concerned relative approach, suggesting that I was having some kind of emotional breakdown and needed professional help to deal with my unrealistic expectations of my family. "Marcus, honey," she said during one particularly condescending phone call, "I know you're upset about losing your job, but taking it out on your family isn't the answer. Your parents love you, and they're worried sick about this vendetta you're pursuing. Don't you think it's time to forgive and forget? Family is all we really have in this world." The irony was breathtaking. They were worried about me, but not worried enough to offer actual emotional support or acknowledge how their treatment had contributed to my decision. They wanted me to forgive and forget, but they showed no signs of recognizing that they'd done anything that required forgiveness. They claimed family was all we had, but they'd proven that their version of family was purely transactional. I thanked Aunt Linda for her concern and politely declined to discuss the situation further. If my family wanted to rebuild our relationship, they knew where to find me, but it would have to be a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not financial obligation disguised as love. Jessica tried a different approach, reaching out through social media with carefully crafted messages designed to look like casual check-ins while actually fishing for information about my financial status. She'd seen through mutual friends that I'd found a new job and was hoping to re-establish the financial pipeline now that my income had been restored. "Hey Marcus, heard you landed a great new position, so proud of you for bouncing back so quickly. You always were the resilient one in the family. Hope we can catch up soon and put all this silly drama behind us." Silly drama? As if my response to their complete lack of compassion was just an overreaction that could be smoothed over with a few kind words and some family guilt. As if the years of financial exploitation could be erased with a congratulations text and an invitation to resume normal operations. I didn't respond to her message, or to the several increasingly direct attempts that followed. She could see that I'd read them, which was probably driving her crazy, but I had no interest in providing her with ammunition for future manipulation attempts. Kevin's strategy was the most predictable. He simply ignored everything that had happened and continued to act as if my financial support was still available. He sent me his tuition bill for the next semester with a casual note asking me to take care of this when you get a chance. The entitlement was so complete, so utterly lacking in self-awareness, that I almost had to admire its audacity. I forwarded his email to Dad, with a simple message: Kevin seems confused about who's responsible for his education expenses. Thought you might want to clarify that for him. Dad's response came within an hour, and it was everything I'd expected and more. He was furious that I'd embarrassed Kevin by refusing to pay his tuition. He was disgusted by my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. He was disappointed in the man I'd become and ashamed to call me his son, but buried in all that familiar manipulation was something new: desperation. For the first time I could hear the panic in his words as he realized that their financial safety net was truly gone. They'd been living beyond their means for so long, subsidized by my contributions, that they'd forgotten how to manage on their actual income. Now they were facing the reality of their choices, and instead of taking responsibility, they were lashing out at me for refusing to continue enabling their dysfunction. You think you're teaching us some kind of lesson, he wrote, but all you're doing is proving that money is more important to you than family. Your mother and I sacrificed everything to raise you, and this is how you repay us: by abandoning us when we need you most. You'll regret this decision for the rest of your life, and when you do, don't come crawling back, expecting forgiveness. I read his message twice, waiting for the familiar surge of guilt and doubt that his disapproval had always triggered, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if he'd finally said out loud what had always been true, but never acknowledged. In his mind, love was a transaction, and I'd violated the terms of our contract by refusing to continue making payments. I saved his message in a special folder on my phone, not because I wanted to torture myself by rereading it, but because I never wanted to forget how quickly love could transform into hatred when financial expectations weren't met. It was a reminder of what I'd escaped, a vaccination against any future temptation to romanticize the family relationships I'd left behind. Starting the new job felt like entering a parallel universe where work was just work, where my paycheck belonged entirely to me, where success was measured by professional achievement rather than how much I could contribute to other people's lifestyles. My new colleagues were friendly and professional, interested in my ideas and expertise rather than my bank account balance. Sarah Mitchell turned out to be an excellent manager, supportive but challenging, always pushing me to grow and learn new skills. She noticed when I worked late on particularly interesting projects and encouraged me to attend conferences and training sessions to advance my career. The company culture really did prioritize employee development, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something meaningful for my own future. The financial freedom was transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. I could afford to live in a better apartment, could buy quality food and clothes, could even start a retirement account that wouldn't be rated for family emergencies. But more importantly, I could make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what other people needed from me. I started taking Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu classes, something I'd always wanted to try but couldn't afford when every spare dollar went to family obligations. I bought a decent bicycle and started exploring Austin's trail system on weekends, instead of spending my free time dealing with the latest family crisis. I even started dating again, meeting people through work and social activities, rather than staying home to save money for the next inevitable emergency. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was living my own life, rather than funding someone else's. 6 months after that devastating group chat, I was walking through downtown Austin after a particularly successful day at work when I saw a familiar figure across the street. Jessica was coming out of a high-end boutique with several shopping bags, laughing with a friend about something. She looked happy and carefree, certainly not like someone whose life had been ruined by my withdrawal of financial support. I ducked into a coffee shop before she could see me, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I realized I felt absolutely nothing about the encounter. No anger, no sadness, no lingering resentment. She was just someone I used to know, someone who'd played a role in a version of my life that no longer existed. Later that evening, Tyler and I were having dinner at a restaurant I never could have afforded during my family supporting years. We were celebrating his promotion and my upcoming 6-month anniversary at the new job, just two friends enjoying their success, without anyone else's needs hanging over the occasion. You know what I realized today? I told him over dessert. I saw Jessica downtown, and I felt nothing. Not angry, not hurt, not even curious about how she's doing. Just nothing. It's like that whole part of my life happened to someone else. Tyler smiled and raised his glass. That's called healing, my friend. You've built a new life, and the old one doesn't have power over you anymore. He was right. I had built a new life, one based on authentic relationships and genuine mutual support, rather than financial manipulation and conditional love. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without challenges, but it was mine. Every success belonged to me, every achievement advanced my own goals, every dollar earned stayed in my own accounts to build my own future. My phone buzzed with a text notification, and for a split second, I felt the old familiar tension. But it was just my neighbor, asking if I could accept a package delivery, a simple favor between people who respected each other's boundaries and time. I texted back that I'd be happy to help, then put my phone away and returned to my conversation with Tyler. The past was truly behind me, and the future was entirely my own to create. As we walked back to our cars after dinner, I thought about that devastating group chat that had changed everything. At the time, it had felt like the worst thing that could happen, a complete betrayal by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Now I could see it for what it really was, a gift. It had forced me to confront the truth about my family relationships and given me the motivation to build something better. I'd lost a family that never really existed in the first place, but I'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a life that actually belonged to me. And that was worth every uncomfortable moment, every guilt trip, every threat of permanent estrangement. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having the people who've been using you finally reveal their true nature. It hurts at first, but once you see clearly, you can never unsee the truth. And that clarity, painful as it might be, is the first step toward real freedom. I drove home to my comfortable apartment, paid for entirely with my own money, to plan for a future that belonged completely to me. And for the first time in my adult life, I fell asleep, without worrying about anyone else's problems, or calculating how much I could afford to give away tomorrow. The peace was extraordinary. 1 year later, I was standing in my new 2-bedroom apartment, in the trendy South Austin area, boxes scattered around the hardwood floors, when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Marcus. The voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and strained. It took me a moment to realize it was my mother. Hello, Patricia. I'd stopped calling her mom months ago, a small psychological shift that helped maintain the emotional distance I'd worked so hard to establish. Marcus, please, I need to talk to you. It's about your father. Her voice cracked on the last word, and despite everything that had happened, I felt a flicker of concern. What about him? I kept my tone neutral, neither warm nor cold, just professionally courteous.
Had a heart attack 3 days ago. He's stable now, but the doctors are saying he needs surgery, and our insurance. She trailed off, and I could practically hear the request forming before she spoke it. Your insurance? What, Patricia? The deductible is $25,000. We've been struggling since we've been managing on our own. The house payment, Jessica's student loans that came due, Kevin's tuition we had to put on credit cards. We're maxed out everywhere, Marcus. I know things have been difficult between us, but he's your father. Family has to come first at times like this. There it was. The same manipulation, the same emotional blackmail, the same assumption that my money existed to solve their problems. Even after a year of no contact, even after all the cruel things they'd said when I'd refused to continue funding their lifestyle, they still saw me as their financial backup plan. I'm sorry to hear about
Robert's health issues, I said carefully. I hope he recovers fully. But Marcus, you don't understand. We need help. I've called everyone, exhausted every option. You're the only one who can afford to help us. Surely you can't let your father suffer because of some petty disagreement we had. Petty disagreement. She was rewriting history in real time, transforming their complete abandonment of me during my crisis into a minor family spat that I was being unreasonable to hold on to. Patricia, I'm not the only one who can afford to help you. You have a house that's probably worth $400,000. You could take out a home equity loan or sell it and downsize. Jessica has been working for over a year now and presumably has savings. Kevin could take a semester off school and get a job to contribute to the family finances. There are multiple solutions to this problem that don't involve me. The silence on the other end stretched so long, I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had transformed from pleading to accusatory. I can't believe you're suggesting we sell our family home. That house has been in our family for 15 years. We raised you children there. Those are precious memories, Marcus. How can you be so heartless? And asking Jessica to sacrifice her savings for her father. She's trying to build her future. Kevin needs his education. You're the one with the high-paying job and no real responsibilities. No real responsibilities. After everything I'd done for them, after years of sacrificing my own financial security for their comfort, she still saw my life as somehow less important, less worthy of protection than theirs. My savings existed for their emergencies, but their savings were sacred, untouchable, reserved for their own dreams and security. Patricia, I have plenty of real responsibilities. I have my own life to build, my own future to secure, my own emergencies to prepare for. You taught me that very clearly when I lost my job and reached out for support. That was different, Marcus. You were young, you could bounce back easily. Your father is 62 years old and facing a serious health crisis. This isn't about money, it's about family loyalty. The gaslighting was so complete, so expertly executed, that I almost admired its craftsmanship. In her version of events, my job loss had been a minor inconvenience that I should have handled independently, while their financial crisis was a life-or-death emergency that required my immediate intervention. My need for emotional support during a difficult time had been weakness, but their need for financial support was justified family obligation. Patricia, I wish you and Robert the best with this situation. I hope you find a solution that works for your family. Marcus, please, I'm begging you. Whatever happened between us, whatever we said, it doesn't matter now. Your father needs surgery and we can't afford it. Surely you can put aside your pride for something this important. My pride. As if standing up for myself, refusing to be exploited, and maintaining healthy boundaries was just wounded ego, rather than basic self-respect. This isn't about pride, Patricia. This is about the fact that you've made it very clear that I'm only valuable to you as a source of funding. When I needed support, you told me to move out and find roommates. When I needed compassion, you called me selfish and ungrateful. When I needed family, you said I was dead to you. Now you want me to pretend none of that happened and write you a check. That's not how relationships work. We were upset, Marcus. We said things we didn't mean. You have to understand, we were scared about the money situation, and we overreacted. But this is different. This is life and death. You weren't scared about the money situation, Patricia. You were angry that your ATM had malfunctioned. And every financial crisis you've had since then has been life and death too, hasn't it? There's always something urgent, always something that requires my immediate financial intervention, always something more important than my own needs or boundaries. I could hear her crying on the other end of the line, soft sobs that once would have broken my resolve immediately. But I'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine emotion and performative manipulation. These weren't tears of grief or fear, they were tears of frustration that her usual tactics weren't working. Marcus, I don't understand what happened to you. You used to be such a caring, generous person. You used to understand that family means sacrifice, that love means putting other people's needs before your own. Now you're cold and selfish, and I don't even recognize you anymore. There it was again, the complete reversal of reality. I'd been cold and selfish when I'd given them thousands of dollars while living paycheck to paycheck. I'd been uncaring and stingy when I'd emptied my emergency fund to cover their crises. But now that I'd stopped allowing them to exploit me, now I was finally taking care of myself, the way they'd always taken care of themselves. I was the villain in their story. Patricia, I recognize myself perfectly well. I'm the same person I always was, just with better boundaries and healthier relationships. I care deeply about people who care about me in return. I'm generous with people who appreciate my generosity rather than treating it as an obligation. I sacrifice for people who would do the same for me. The difference is that I no longer confuse enabling with love. This is your father we're talking about, Marcus. The man who raised you, who taught you everything you know, who worked hard to provide for you and your siblings. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Robert provided for me until I turned 18, which was his legal and moral obligation as my parent. Since then, I've provided far more financial support to this family than he ever provided to me. I've more than repaid any debt I might have owed for my childhood, with interest. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia cycling through every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. She tried guilt, shame, anger, bargaining, and threats of permanent estrangement. She painted me as heartless, selfish, vindictive, and cruel. She invoked family loyalty, childhood memories, and moral obligation. She even tried to weaponize my father's condition, suggesting that if he died because they couldn't afford his surgery, his blood would be on my hands. But none of it worked, because I'd finally learned to see these tactics for what they were. Desperate attempts to maintain control over someone who'd escaped their influence. Every accusation revealed more about their character than mine. Every threat proved how conditional their love had always been. Every guilt trip demonstrated their complete inability to take responsibility for their own choices and consequences. When she finally exhausted herself and the conversation ended, I felt nothing but relief. There was no guilt, no doubt about my decision, no temptation to rescue them from the consequences of their own financial mismanagement. They'd created this crisis through years of living beyond their means, subsidized by my contributions. Now they could solve it using the same resources they'd always expected me to sacrifice: their house, their savings, their ability to work and earn money. I finished unpacking my apartment, a beautiful space in a great neighborhood that I could afford because my money wasn't disappearing into other people's emergencies every month. The second bedroom was set up as an office where I could work on freelance projects and continue building my career. The living room had furniture I'd chosen because I liked it, not because it was the cheapest option available after sending money home. This was what life looked like when you prioritized your own well-being, when you built relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial transactions. When you refused to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. 2 weeks later, I ran into Kevin at a grocery store near my old apartment. He looked older, more tired than I remembered, and there was something defeated in his posture that hadn't been there before. He saw me first and approached with obvious reluctance. "Marcus," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, Kevin. How are you?" "I'm okay, working at a warehouse now, trying to save up for school. Had to take some time off when Dad got sick. So he'd been forced to take responsibility for his own life, to contribute to the family finances instead of just consuming them. The world hadn't ended, he'd simply had to do what millions of other people did every day, work to pay for the things he wanted." I heard about Robert's situation. "How is he doing?" "He's okay. Surgery went well. Mom's been pretty stressed about the medical bills and everything." He paused, clearly debating whether to say more. "She's been talking about you a lot lately." "I'm sure she has. Look, Marcus, I know things got weird between us all, and I know you're probably still angry about everything that happened. But maybe we could grab coffee sometime. Just to talk." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But what I saw was just exhaustion and what might have been genuine remorse. Kevin had always been the least malicious member of the family, more thoughtlessly entitled than deliberately cruel. "What would you want to talk about, Kevin?" "I don't know, everything, I guess. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how we treated you when you lost your job. I was pretty young and stupid, but that's not really an excuse. I said some terrible things, and I never apologized for that. This was unexpected. In the year since I'd cut contact with my family, none of them had acknowledged any wrongdoing on their part. They'd painted themselves as victims of my sudden selfishness, innocent casualties of my unreasonable demands for respect and reciprocity." "What made you start thinking about it?" Kevin laughed bitterly. "Having to work 40 hours a week at a job I hate while trying to save money for school. Realizing how much you must have been working, how much you must have been sacrificing to cover all our expenses on top of your own. I never thought about where that money was coming from, what you were giving up to help us. I just assumed it was easy for you because you made good money." It was a small admission, but it was the first time any member of my family had acknowledged that my financial support had required sacrifice on my part. For years, they'd acted as if my contributions were effortless, as if writing them checks was no more difficult than breathing. "It wasn't easy, Kevin. I was working 60 hours a week and living like a college student so I could afford to help with everyone's emergencies. I couldn't save money, couldn't invest in my own future, couldn't even buy decent food most of the time. But every time I tried to talk about it, I got accused of being selfish or ungrateful. I know, and I'm sorry for that. We were all pretty terrible to you, and you didn't deserve it, especially when you lost your job and needed support. That was really messed up." The apology was more than I'd expected, and less than I'd needed. It didn't erase years of exploitation and emotional manipulation, but it was acknowledgement that those things had happened, which was more than I'd gotten from anyone else in the family. "I appreciate you saying that, Kevin. It means something to hear it acknowledged. Would you consider having coffee with me? Not to ask for anything, not to try to convince you to come back or start sending money again. Just to talk, maybe try to understand each other better." I thought about it for a moment. The old Marcus would have seen this as an opening, a chance to rebuild the family relationships that had defined so much of his identity. But the new Marcus understood that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once revealed to be fundamentally unhealthy, couldn't be fixed with apologies and good intentions. "Kevin, I appreciate that you've been reflecting on what happened, and I appreciate your apology. But I've built a new life now, one that works better for me. I don't think going backward is healthy for either of us." He nodded slowly, and I could see disappointment in his eyes, but also understanding. "I get it. I probably wouldn't want to reconnect either if I were in your position. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to talk, you know how to reach me." We said goodbye politely, and I watched him walk away with his cart full of generic groceries and discount brands. There was a part of me that felt sad about the finality of it, the closing of a chapter that had once been central to my identity. But there was a larger part of me that felt peaceful, confident that I'd made the right choice for my own well-being. As I drove home to my apartment, I reflected on how much my life had changed in the past year. I'd been promoted twice at work, and was now leading a team of developers on cutting-edge projects. I'd started dating someone wonderful, a woman named Rachel, who was financially independent and emotionally mature, who brought her own resources and stability to our relationship rather than looking for someone to solve her problems. I'd traveled to 3 different countries, something I'd never been able to afford when my money was constantly flowing to family emergencies. I'd taken up rock climbing and photography, had joined a book club and a hiking group, had built a social circle of people who valued me for my company rather than my bank account. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about people and relationships. I'd developed the ability to recognize manipulation and exploitation early, before they could take root and grow into something destructive. I'd learned that love without respect was meaningless, that family without boundaries was toxic, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who claim to care about you. The phone call from Patricia had been a test, and I'd passed it. The encounter with Kevin had been another test, and I'd passed that too. Not with anger or bitterness, but with the calm confidence that comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve. That evening, Rachel and I cooked dinner together in my kitchen, planning a weekend trip to New Mexico, where we'd do some hiking and photography. We talked about work and friends and books we'd been reading, the normal conversations of 2 independent adults who'd chosen to share their lives because they enjoyed each other's company. My phone sat silent on the counter, no emergency calls or guilt-laden texts interrupting our evening. No one was demanding my immediate financial attention or questioning my commitment to family loyalty. No one was treating me like a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be cherished. This was what healthy relationships looked like. This was what life looked like when you refused to accept less than mutual respect and genuine care. This was what freedom felt like when you finally stopped confusing obligation with love. As I fell asleep that night in my comfortable bed in my beautiful apartment, paid for with money that belonged entirely to me, I felt nothing but gratitude for that devastating group chat that had changed everything. It had been the wake-up call I'd needed, the push that had forced me to choose between continuing to enable dysfunction and finally choosing myself. I'd chosen myself, and it had been the best decision I'd ever made. The family that had rejected me when I needed them most was now struggling with the consequences of their own choices, while I was thriving in a life built on authentic relationships and healthy boundaries. They'd lost their financial safety net, but I'd gained something infinitely more valuable: genuine peace, real security, and the unshakable knowledge that I was worth more than what I could provide to other people. Sometimes the most devastating betrayal becomes the greatest gift, because it forces you to see clearly and choose better. Sometimes losing the people who claim to love you is the first step toward finding the people who actually do. 2 years had passed since that life-changing group chat when I received an unexpected letter in my mailbox. It was hand-delivered, not mailed, which immediately caught my attention. The return address showed my old family home in Cedar Park, and the handwriting was unmistakably Jessica's careful script. I sat in my home office, looking out at the view of downtown Austin from my new condo, holding the envelope without opening it. By this point, I'd built an incredible life that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible when I was trapped in that cycle of financial manipulation. My consulting business was thriving, I'd written a book about financial boundaries that had become a bestseller, and Rachel and I had gotten engaged 6 months earlier. The life I'd created was rich with genuine relationships, professional fulfillment, and authentic experiences. I traveled frequently for speaking engagements about financial independence and healthy family dynamics. My story had resonated with thousands of people who'd found themselves in similar situations, trapped by family members who confused love with financial exploitation. But here was this letter, a ghost from my past, arriving just as I was about to close the biggest consulting contract of my career. I opened it carefully, curious, despite myself, about what Jessica might have to say, after 2 years of complete silence.
Dear Marcus, it began, and I could immediately tell this wasn't going to be another manipulation attempt. The tone was different, more subdued, less entitled than anything I'd ever received from her before. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I completely understand if you throw this letter away without reading it, but I needed to try to reach out one more time, not to ask for anything, but to tell you some things I should have said years ago. I've been in therapy for the past 18 months, working through a lot of issues about money and relationships and family dynamics. My therapist helped me understand how badly we treated you, how unfair and manipulative we were, and how much damage we did to someone we claim to love. I want you to know that I finally understand what we put you through. I understand that we treated you like a bank instead of a brother. I understand that we took advantage of your generosity and kindness, and then punished you when you finally stood up for yourself. I understand that we failed you completely when you needed support, and then had the audacity to act like victims when you protected yourself from our toxicity. I'm not writing this to try to win you back, or to get you to forgive us. I'm writing this because you deserve to hear that at least one person in this family recognizes how wrong we were, and takes full responsibility for the pain we caused you. Mom and Dad are still convinced they did nothing wrong. They still talk about you like you're the selfish one who abandoned the family over money. They don't understand that it was never about money, it was about respect and basic human decency, things we never showed you despite everything you did for us. Kevin is doing better. He finished his degree last year while working full-time, and I think the experience of having to actually work for what he wanted taught him a lot about responsibility and gratitude. He talks about you sometimes, usually wondering if you're doing okay and whether he'll ever get a chance to make things right. As for me, I've had to face some uncomfortable truths about who I was and how I treated people. I realized that I'd learned from Mom and Dad to see your success as something that belonged to all of us, rather than something you'd earned through your own hard work. I thought your money was our money, and your achievements were our achievements, and your sacrifices were just what you were supposed to do as the successful one in the family. I know now how completely backwards and toxic that thinking was. I know now that we stole years of your life, thousands of dollars of your money, and countless opportunities for you to build your own dreams. I know that we took someone who loved us unconditionally and turned him into a resource to be extracted from rather than a person to be cherished. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a response to this letter. I don't expect anything from you, because I finally understand that expecting things from you is what got us into this mess in the first place. I just wanted you to know that at least one person in this family sees clearly now. I wanted you to know that your decision to cut us off was completely justified and probably the healthiest thing you could have done. I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you for choosing yourself, even though it took me years to understand why that choice was necessary. I hope you're happy, Marcus. I hope you found people who appreciate you for who you are, rather than what you can provide. I hope you've built the life you always deserved but never had the chance to create while you were busy funding ours. If you ever decide you want to talk, I'm here. But I'm not waiting for that day or planning my life around the possibility. I'm working on building my own healthy relationships and taking responsibility for my own financial security, things I should have learned to do years ago instead of relying on your generosity. Thank you for everything you did for us, even though we never deserved it. Thank you for finally standing up for yourself, even though it cost you a family. Thank you for showing me, through your strength and boundaries, what real self-respect looks like. With genuine remorse and hope for your happiness, Jessica. I read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden manipulation or subtle requests for reconciliation, but there weren't any. This was something I'd never expected to receive, a complete unqualified acknowledgement of the dysfunction that had characterized our family relationships, written by someone who had clearly done serious work to understand her own role in that toxicity. The letter didn't erase the years of exploitation or the pain of their rejection when I'd needed them most. It didn't change the fact that they'd revealed their true priorities when I'd lost my job and reached out for support. But it did provide something I hadn't realized I needed: validation, that my perception of events had been accurate, that my decision to protect myself had been justified, and that at least one member of my former family understood the gravity of what had happened. I set the letter aside and walked out onto my balcony, looking out at the city where I'd rebuilt my entire life. The consulting business I'd started had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. The book I'd written had helped thousands of people recognize and escape similar family dynamics. The speaking engagements I did at conferences and universities were helping to change conversations about financial boundaries and healthy relationships. All of this had been possible because I'd finally chosen to invest in myself, instead of subsidizing other people's irresponsibility. Every dollar I'd once sent home was now working to build something meaningful and sustainable. Every hour I'd once spent managing their crises was now devoted to pursuing my own goals and nurturing relationships that enhanced rather than drained my life. Rachel found me on the balcony an hour later, concern in her eyes as she noticed the letter in my hand. "Everything okay?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Letter from Jessica," I said, handing it to her. "It's not what you'd expect." Rachel read it carefully, her expression shifting from wariness to surprise, to something that looked like respect. "Wow," she said when she finished. "This is actually a real apology. No conditions, no requests, no subtle manipulation, just acknowledgement and accountability. I know, I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the hidden agenda to reveal itself, but I think this might actually be genuine. How does it make you feel?" It was a good question, one I'd been struggling with since opening the envelope. The answer was complicated, layered with emotions I hadn't expected to feel. "Relieved, mostly," I said finally. "For years I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if I'd misunderstood their intentions, if I'd thrown away relationships that could have been repaired. This letter confirms that my assessment was accurate, that the boundary I set was necessary, and that my decision to prioritize my own well-being was justified. Do you want to respond to her?" I thought about it for a long moment. The old Marcus, the one who'd been conditioned to repair relationships at any cost, would have jumped at this opportunity. He would have seen Jessica's letter as an opening to rebuild the family connections that had once defined his identity. But the person I'd become understood something crucial: acknowledgement of wrongdoing didn't automatically create the foundation for a healthy relationship. Jessica's growth and self-awareness were admirable, but they didn't erase the fundamental incompatibility between her family's approach to relationships and my own hard-won understanding of boundaries and mutual respect. "Maybe someday," I said, "but not now. I've built something good here, something that works for me. I don't want to complicate it by trying to integrate people who were part of such a toxic dynamic, even if they've changed." Rachel nodded understandingly. She'd heard the full story of my family situation, had seen how much work it had taken for me to break free from those patterns and build healthier ways of relating to people. She understood that protecting what we'd created together was more important than exploring possibilities with people from my past. That evening, we had dinner with Tyler and his wife, celebrating the latest milestone in my consulting business. The conversation was easy and supportive, filled with genuine excitement about each other's successes and authentic care about our challenges. This was what family was supposed to feel like: people who celebrated your achievements without expecting to benefit from them, who offered support without keeping score, who valued your happiness as an end in itself rather than as a means to their own comfort. As I listened to Tyler tell a story about his latest project, I reflected on how completely my understanding of relationships had transformed. I'd once believed that love meant sacrifice, that family meant obligation, that success meant sharing everything you earned with people who shared your DNA. I'd confused enabling with generosity, manipulation with affection, and exploitation with loyalty. Now I understood that real love enhanced, rather than diminished, the people involved. Healthy families celebrated each other's independence and success, rather than seeking to control or benefit from it. True relationships were built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The business I'd built was a direct result of this new understanding. My book and speaking engagements helped people recognize the difference between healthy support systems and toxic exploitation. The consulting work I did helped individuals and families establish boundaries that protected their resources while maintaining authentic connections. One of my favorite success stories involved a client named David who'd been supporting his parents' lavish lifestyle for over a decade while living in a studio apartment and driving a 15-year-old
car. When he'd finally established boundaries and redirected his money toward his own goals, his parents had initially reacted with fury and accusations of selfishness. But unlike my family, David's parents had eventually recognized the unsustainability of their approach. They'd downsized their lifestyle, found ways to manage their expenses on their actual income, and rebuilt their relationship with David on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The result was a stronger, more authentic family dynamic where everyone contributed according to their abilities, and no one was expected to sacrifice their own security for others' comfort. It was possible for families to change, to grow, to establish healthier patterns. But it required acknowledgement of the problematic dynamics, genuine commitment to change from all parties involved, and a willingness to prioritize relationship health over financial convenience. My family had never shown any indication of being willing or able to make those changes. Jessica's letter suggested that she might be an exception, but one person's growth couldn't fix a fundamentally dysfunctional family system. And I'd learned that I didn't have an obligation to participate in that system just because we shared genetic material. The next morning, I made my decision about Jessica's letter. I sat down at my computer and composed a brief response. Jessica, thank you for your letter. I can see that you've done significant work to understand what happened between us, and I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility for your part in those dynamics. Your acknowledgement of the situation means more to me than you probably realize. For a long time, I questioned my own perceptions and wondered if I'd been too harsh in my response to how I was treated. Your letter confirms that my decision to establish boundaries was necessary and appropriate. I'm glad to hear that you're building healthier relationships and taking responsibility for your own financial security. Those are crucial skills that will serve you well in all areas of your life. I wish you continued growth and happiness in your journey. While I don't see a path forward for rebuilding our relationship at this time, I hold no ill will toward you, and I'm genuinely glad that you've found clarity about these issues. Take care, Marcus. I printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and dropped it in the mail that afternoon. It felt like closing a chapter definitively but kindly, acknowledging Jessica's growth while maintaining the boundaries that had made my current life possible. That weekend, Rachel and I drove up to a cabin in the hill country that we'd rented for a long weekend getaway. As we sat on the deck watching the sunset over the rolling hills, she brought up the subject of Jessica's letter again. "Do you think you'll ever regret not trying to reconnect with her?" she asked. It was a question I'd been pondering since receiving the letter. The answer came to me with surprising clarity. "No," I said, "because reconnecting would require me to step back into a family system that was fundamentally unhealthy for me. Even if Jessica has changed, even if she's genuinely committed to different patterns, the rest of the family hasn't. And I can't maintain a relationship with one member without getting pulled back into the drama and dysfunction of the whole system." "You're protecting what you've built," Rachel said, and it wasn't a question. "Exactly. I've learned that you can't love people at the expense of your own well-being. I spent years trying to love my family back to health, trying to demonstrate through my generosity and sacrifice that relationships could be based on mutual care rather than exploitation. It didn't work because change has to come from within. I can't fix people who don't want to be fixed. And you've found people who don't need to be fixed." I looked at her, at the woman who'd brought her own stability and strength to our relationship, who enhanced rather than drained my life, who celebrated my success without expecting to profit from it. She was right. I'd found my chosen family among friends and colleagues, and ultimately with her, people who understood that love meant wanting the best for each other rather than wanting things from each other. As the stars came out over the Texas hill country, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The pain of losing my original family had been excruciating, but it had forced me to discover what healthy relationships actually looked like. The financial exploitation had been devastating, but recovering from it had taught me skills and insights that had become the foundation of a meaningful career helping others. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you, but only if you're willing to learn from it, grow through it, and use it to make better choices going forward. My phone buzzed with a text from a potential client who'd read my book and wanted to schedule a consultation. Another person trapped in a cycle of financial manipulation by family members, another opportunity to help someone recognize their own worth and establish healthy boundaries. This was my life, now helping people understand that they deserve relationships based on mutual respect, showing them that it's possible to love their families while still protecting themselves, teaching them that financial boundaries aren't selfish but necessary for sustainable relationships. I'd lost a family that never truly valued me, but I'd gained a purpose that fulfilled me and impacted thousands of other people dealing with similar struggles. I'd traded exploitation for authenticity, obligation for genuine care, and financial manipulation for economic freedom. It had been the best trade I'd ever made. As Rachel and I headed inside for the night, I took one last look at the stars scattered across the clear Texas sky. Somewhere out there, my original family was probably still struggling with the consequences of their financial choices, still convinced that I was the selfish one who'd abandoned them over money. But here I was, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide, building a life and career that mattered, making a difference in the world by helping others escape the same toxic dynamics I'd once been trapped in. They'd wanted me to believe that family came first, that love meant sacrifice, that success was meaningless if you didn't share it with people who shared your DNA. But I'd learned that family could be chosen, that love meant respect, and that the greatest success was building a life that reflected your own values and priorities rather than other people's expectations. I'd chosen well, and I'd never been happier to be proven right. 5 years had transformed everything. I was standing in the green room of a major television studio in New York City, preparing for an appearance on a national morning show to discuss my second book, Breaking Free: How to Escape Financial Manipulation and Build Authentic Relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that the worst day of my life had eventually led to this moment, where I was about to share my story with millions of people who might be trapped in similar situations. My phone buzzed with a message from my publicist confirming the interview details, followed immediately by a text from Rachel reminding me that she was proud of me and would be watching from our home in Austin. We'd been married for 2 years now, and our relationship continued to be everything my family relationships had never been: supportive, equal, and built on genuine mutual respect. The success of my consulting business had exceeded every expectation. What had started as a way to help individuals establish financial boundaries had evolved into a comprehensive practice that worked with families, corporations, and even government agencies on issues related to financial manipulation and economic abuse. The waiting list for my services stretched 6 months out, and I'd had to hire a team of associate consultants to handle the demand. But it wasn't the professional success that meant the most to me, though I was certainly proud of what I'd built. It was the letters I received almost daily from people who'd read my books, or attended my seminars, and found the courage to change their own situations. Parents who'd stopped enabling adult children's irresponsible behavior. Adult children who'd established boundaries with financially manipulative parents. spouses who'd recognized and escaped economically abusive marriages. Each story reminded me why this work mattered and validated the pain I'd experienced in breaking free from my own toxic family dynamics. As I waited for my television appearance, I thought about how dramatically different my life looked compared to 5 years ago. The apartment I'd lived in when I lost my job seemed like it belonged to a different person entirely. That Marcus had been trapped in a cycle of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing that kept him perpetually stressed, financially insecure, and emotionally exhausted. This Marcus lived in a beautiful home with his wife, traveled the world speaking at conferences, and had built a career around helping others avoid the mistakes he'd made. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. There had been moments of doubt, periods of loneliness, and times when I'd wondered if I'd been too harsh in cutting off my family completely. But each milestone in my personal and professional growth had reinforced that I'd made the right choice. Every healthy relationship I'd built, every financial goal I'd achieved, every peaceful night's sleep I'd enjoyed, had been possible only because I'd finally learned to put my own well-being first. My phone rang with a call from an unknown number. For a split second, I felt the old familiar tension that used to accompany unknown calls, the fear that it might be a family member with another crisis or emergency that required my immediate attention. But that anxiety faded quickly as I remembered that those days were long behind me. I let it go to voicemail, focused on preparing for the interview that would reach more people than any single consultation or seminar ever could. The producer came to get me, and I walked onto the brightly lit set with confidence that would have been impossible during those early days of financial stress and family drama. The host, Jennifer Martinez, greeted me warmly, and we settled into the interview chairs as the cameras prepared to roll. We're here with Marcus Thompson, author of the best-selling book Breaking Free, and one of the country's leading experts on financial manipulation within families, Jennifer began. Marcus, your story begins with what many people would consider a normal family dynamic. Can you tell us what changed your perspective? I'd told this story hundreds of times by now, but it never got easier to revisit those painful memories. The difference was that now I could share them from a place of strength and healing rather than fresh wounds and raw emotion. I think the turning point came when I lost my job and reached out to my family for emotional support. I began. Instead of getting the compassion and encouragement I needed, I was told that losing my job was actually a good thing because it would force me to move back home and find cheaper housing. The disconnect between what I needed and what they offered made me realize that our relationships had never been about mutual support at all. You write about spending thousands of dollars supporting your family over several years. How did that dynamic develop? It started gradually, the way most financial manipulation does. A small emergency here, a temporary shortage there. Each request seemed reasonable in isolation, and I wanted to be helpful and generous. But over time, my financial support became an expectation rather than a gift. My family had restructured their entire lifestyle around my contributions, while I was living paycheck to paycheck despite having a good salary. Jennifer leaned forward with interest. What was the breaking point for you? The breaking point was realizing that they saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. When I needed support, they immediately started calculating how my unemployment would affect their lifestyle. There was no concern for my well-being, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices I'd been making for years, just irritation that their funding source had been interrupted. That must have been devastating to realize. It was heartbreaking, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I could see the relationship dynamics clearly. I understood that I'd been confusing enabling with love, that I'd been so focused on proving my worth through financial generosity that I'd never demanded basic respect or reciprocity. You made the difficult decision to cut off all financial support to your family. How did they react? Exactly the way you'd expect people to react when they realize their financial safety net is gone. Anger, threats, guilt trips, emotional manipulation. They tried every tactic they could think of to restore the previous dynamic. What they never tried was genuine accountability or acknowledgement of how their treatment had contributed to my decision. Do you have any regrets about that choice? This was the question I got most frequently, and the answer had become clearer with each passing year. None whatsoever. That decision gave me my life back. It allowed me to build genuine financial security, to invest in my own future, to develop relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial transactions. Everything good in my life today stems from that one moment when I finally chose to prioritize my own well-being. Your work now focuses on helping other people recognize and escape similar dynamics. What advice do you give to someone who suspects they're being financially manipulated by family members? The first step is recognizing that love and money are separate things. If someone's affection for you depends on your financial contributions, that's not love at all. Real family relationships should enhance your life, not drain your resources and emotional energy. The second step is understanding that setting financial boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for sustainable relationships. You've helped thousands of people through your books and consulting work. What's the most common misconception you encounter? People think that cutting off financial support means cutting off love, but it's actually the opposite. When you stop enabling someone's irresponsible behavior, you're giving them the opportunity to grow and take responsibility for their own lives. Some people will rise to that challenge and become healthier, more independent individuals. Others will choose to remain angry rather than change their behavior. But either way, you're no longer participating in a dynamic that's harmful to everyone involved. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, covering the practical aspects of establishing financial boundaries and the emotional process of healing from family trauma. As we wrapped up, Jennifer asked one final question that caught me off guard. Marcus, if you could go back and change how things unfolded with your family, would you? I paused for a moment, considering the question seriously. Would I want to go back to those relationships if they could magically become healthy? Would I trade the life I'd built for a fantasy version where my family had learned to love me without exploiting me? No, I said finally, because the person I am today, the work I do, the relationships I've built, the impact I've been able to have, all of that came from walking through that fire and emerging stronger. I wouldn't be able to help other people escape similar situations if I hadn't experienced it myself. Sometimes the most painful experiences in our lives become the foundation for our greatest contributions. After the interview, I took a cab back to my hotel and called Rachel to debrief about how it had gone. She'd watched it live and was excited about the response already pouring in on social media. People were sharing their own stories, expressing gratitude for feeling less alone in their struggles, and asking for information about my books and consulting services. You reached so many people today, she said. I can already see comments from people saying they're going to have difficult conversations with family members this weekend because of what you shared. It was humbling to think that my personal nightmare had become a source of hope and guidance for others. The pain I'd experienced had been transformed into purpose, and the isolation I'd felt during those early days had led to connections with thousands of people facing similar challenges. That evening, I had dinner with my literary agent to discuss the outline for my third book, which would focus on rebuilding your life after escaping financial manipulation. We talked about the psychological process of healing from family trauma, the practical steps involved in creating financial independence, and the journey of learning to trust your own judgment about people and relationships.
As I walked back to my hotel, through the bustling streets of Manhattan, I reflected on how dramatically my definition of success had evolved. 5 years ago, success had meant earning enough money to support both my own life and my family's expectations. It had meant being seen as generous and reliable, even if that meant sacrificing my own security and happiness. Now success meant building a life that reflected my own values and priorities. It meant surrounding myself with people who appreciated me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. It meant using my experiences and insights to help others avoid the same mistakes I'd made. It meant waking up each morning excited about the day ahead, rather than dreading the next financial crisis or emotional manipulation. The next morning, I flew back to Austin and drove straight home to Rachel, who was waiting with champagne and takeout from my favorite restaurant. We spent the evening celebrating the successful interview and planning our upcoming vacation to Italy, something I never could have afforded during my family supporting years. "I'm proud of you," she said, as we sat on our back patio, watching the sunset over the hills outside the city. Not just for the interview, or the books, or the business success, but for having the courage to choose yourself when it mattered most. A lot of people never learn to do that. She was right. The hardest part of my journey hadn't been the practical aspects of cutting off financial support or dealing with the angry phone calls and guilt trips. The hardest part had been overcoming a lifetime of conditioning that told me my worth was tied to what I could do for other people, that love required self-sacrifice, that family obligations trumped personal well-being. Learning to value myself as much as I valued others had been revolutionary. Understanding that my needs and dreams were as important as anyone else's had transformed not just my family relationships, but every aspect of my life. I'd become a better friend, partner, and professional, because I was finally operating from a place of strength and self-respect rather than desperation and people-pleasing. My phone buzzed with a text from a potential client who'd seen the morning show interview. Another person trapped in a cycle of financial manipulation, another opportunity to help someone recognize their own worth and establish healthy boundaries. This was my life now, and I couldn't imagine anything more meaningful. As Rachel and I headed inside for the night, I thought about all the people who were probably struggling with similar family dynamics right now. People who were giving more than they could afford, accepting less than they deserved, and wondering why they felt so exhausted and resentful despite their generous hearts. I hoped some of them had seen the interview. I hoped they would read my books and realize they weren't alone in their struggles. I hoped they would find the courage to establish boundaries and build lives that truly belong to them. Most of all, I hoped they would learn what I'd learned, that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones you need to protect yourself from the most. That family doesn't give anyone the right to exploit or manipulate you. That choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's essential for creating the kind of life and relationships that actually nourish your soul. The journey from that devastating group chat to this moment had been longer and more difficult than I'd ever imagined. But it had also been more rewarding than I'd dared to hope. I'd lost a family that had never truly valued me, but I'd gained something infinitely more precious, a life that was authentically mine, built on relationships that enhanced rather than drained me, dedicated to helping others find their own path to freedom and self-respect. That night, as I fell asleep next to the woman I loved, in the home we'd created together, I felt nothing but gratitude for the courage I'd found to walk away from people who had confused love with control, generosity with obligation, and family with financial exploitation. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is losing the people who never deserved you in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.